Thank you so much. And I am equally excited to, introduce our next pair. So I would like to introduce Eli, who was on the Teen Book Selection Committee. Eli Kelly, thank you so much for being here. And I would like to introduce our next author, Nick Brooks. Thank you so much for being here. And Eli is going to give us a little intro.
Okay, Nick Brooks is an author and award-winning filmmaker from Washington, D.C. He's written Promise Boys, our primary title pick for 2024's All CT Reads, as well as the middle grade Ethan Fairmount series and some picture books. Before filmmaking and writing, Nick's love for storytelling, beyond filmmaking and writing, Nick's love for storytelling extends to music through rapping under Ben Kenobi and composing music for films and television. And then before becoming a filmmaker, he was an educator, and his experiences there have helped influence much of his storytelling.
Yeah, thank you. You want me to go ahead and jump in? Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. I would love to tell you a little bit about me, a little bit about my story, and then a little bit about my book Promise Boys. But as you mentioned, I'm from Washington D.C. And my journey has been quite interesting as a storyteller. I started off as you said, as a rapper. At 14 and 15, thinking that was going to be the thing to really take me out of the city, and it turned out to be something else. Once I pivoted, I became an educator. I started teaching at-risk young men from middle school on up through 12th grade. Young men who are considered at risk because they had some difficulty, acclimating to traditional classroom settings. But of course, me being one of those kids as a teenager, I understood that all they needed was some extra love. And so I took that and I started working for an organization called Concerned Black Men, doing character development training there in Washington, D.C. And then I ended up joining a program called Teach for America, where I became a core member and was teaching in Southeast D.C. And it was a big pivot. I went from teaching, working with the population I was working with, to teaching kindergarten and first grade students. And so it was a huge transition. But it started me on this different path of writing, because one of the first thing I noticed was that there weren't a lot of books that featured characters that looked like my kids, or there weren't a lot of books that talked about our community. And so at the time, I was working at a charter network called, well, I won't say the charter network's name, but I was working at a charter network, and they had these different values that they wanted the student to exemplify, even at 5 years old. Values like being prepared and attentive. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, it just kind of gets a little muffled a little bit sometimes and then comes back. It's, I think, just a weird tech gremlin moment.
Gotcha. Well, let me know if it continues to have some difficulty. I could take these headphones out. But yeah, so they wanted my students to exemplify these different values: prepared, attentive, thoughtful, hardworking, or just some of them. And I quickly realized that we weren't giving the children the tools to be able to exemplify those things. They didn't know what those words meant. What does it mean to be prepared? What does it mean to be attentive at 5 years old? These are not things that they necessarily understood. And so they would give out these awards at my school for every kid every week who exemplified these traits the most. And it was always the same students throughout the school. And I quickly realized it was because these students were having supplemental, material given to them at home, and all of our students weren't being given that. So I said, you know what, I want to change this. And so I started writing children's books called The Adventures of Yanni. And I wrote a curriculum to accompany the books. And explicitly, we talked about what it meant to be prepared, attentive, thoughtful, and hardworking. And so I'd say within maybe 3 weeks, not only were my students exemplifying what these traits meant, but they were using the vocabulary. They would be with other teachers, or they'd be in the cafeteria, or they'd be at recess saying, I'm prepared, or saying, I was just thoughtful just then. And my principal came to me and said, Mr. Brooks, what are you doing? Like this is a change. And I got, observed. As a teacher, sometimes your administration will come observe you. And they saw that I had wrote these books, and I was finding pictures online to match my words and to teach my kids. And so from there, my charter network actually gave me grant money, seed money, to have my books illustrated and launch my very first children's series. And so that's how my journey began as a book writer. And then that took me to, Los Angeles, California, where I started to study film, because me as a storyteller wanted to see how I can broaden the scope, how I can put images on screen. And And so I went to University of Southern California, went through their film program, and I graduated in 2020 for grad school. And of course, we all know what happened in 2020. The world completely shifts, right? Everything stops. And for me, it was about, what do I do now? What do I do next? The industry that I just moved here for is shut down. Everything shut down. But I thought back to Yanni, and I thought back to, time in my life where I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to make impact. I knew I wanted to tell the stories of the kids that I was serving. And so similarly, I said, let me do the same thing. And so this is when I started my journey as a novelist. In 2020 is when I began writing both my Ethan Fairmont series and Promise Boys. And so Promise Boys, getting into why we're here today, Promise Boys is really a big piece of my heart. Promise Boys is kind of the culmination of everything I saw as an educator. From going back from, the reason I tell this long story is because, going back from when I was teaching character development and I was working with those young men, and then I moved into the school system and the charter school system and was teaching these kids. All of those things really shaped how Promise Boys came about. And so as an educator, I routinely saw that Black and brown kids were being stripped of their identity, their autonomy, and even their love for learning. And schools in low-income communities often emphasize good behavior, classroom management over learning. And so asking teachers to spend more time building out their classroom consequences and finding ways to make personal connections with kids weren't necessarily at the top of the list. And so Promise Boys exists in a world that's very similar to this, right? A world where inner city schools are grooming kids for two paths. Those paths are prison or worker. That's what I saw as an educator. And so a world where kids are constantly left without an advocate and made to fend for themselves. And I know this world all too well because, again, I was one of those kids. And so if you haven't had a chance to read it, Promise Boys is set in my hometown of Washington, D.C. It centers in on Urban Promise Prep, a fictional all-boys charter school with claims to turn the roughest, toughest stones into the brightest diamonds. And this is all led by a no-nonsense authoritarian principal named Principal Moore. But hopefully I'm not spoiling anything. But suddenly and tragically, Principal Moore is killed in cold blood at the school. And there are three boys who emerge as suspects of this crime: JB, Trey, and Ramon. And so what ensues is this sort of winding mystery that uncovers dark secrets about not just Promise Prep, but Principal Moore. And even our three suspects, right? They have secrets and they have a past. And so ultimately, through this journey, we illuminate the identity of the murderer. So this is the whodunit, right? And this is what I grew up on. I grew up reading the Hardy Boys and the Babysitter's Club and all of these different things. And so for me, mystery was always the thing that grabbed me most. And so that's why it's something that I wanted to write. But while the mystery is pulsing, the characters are even more dynamic. JB, Trey, and Ramon are all kids that we can empathize with. They're kids that we've met before, that we've had in our classroom, kids that we will certainly grow attached to as you read this book. And so because of my experience working specifically with Black boys in DC, I see the extraordinary value in a story like Promise Boys, one that not only humanizes a population of students commonly referred to as at-risk, as I mentioned, but also calls out ways that our current education system has created these sort of school to prison pipelines in inner city schools, right? And so Promise Boys is for, I put in the beginning, this is dedicated to the boys of Chocolate City, which if I might be aging myself, but Chocolate City is DC if you're not familiar. But Promise Boys is for all the Black and brown boys of my hometown of DC and across the world, that feel forgotten, abandoned, and alone. I know I certainly have not forgotten you. I will continue to do the work to tell the story, to tell your story, and hopefully inspire you all as much as you've inspired me. And so I want to thank all the students who this has been an incredible journey. Came out almost a year ago to the day. We'll be at a year in a couple of weeks here, and I spent all of last year going to high schools and middle schools, schools from all across the nation. And I'll tell you, our kids are resilient. I get the most incredible questions, like how do we dismantle white supremacy, like from high school. I mean, it's really been incredible. And so for me, it's just, that's all I can say. At that point, I get speechless because it's really just about hoping that this book continues to inspire our kids to give them the vocabulary to advocate for themselves if they're in situations like these three boys, JB, Trey, Ramon. So, with that, I feel like I'm just rambling at this point. But again, I appreciate you all for having me. I appreciate everybody who's engaged with Promise Boys, everybody who's taking the time to read it. And again, hopefully this is something we can continue to spread. Let's continue to put into students' hands and make this a conversation amongst not just students, not just administrators, not just teachers, but also policymakers and parents, making sure that we really have a real conversation about how we're educating our kids in this country and how we can do better. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Our first question is from, even if you've read the physical book, I think it's worth additionally listening to. It was really good.
Thank you for that question. That was a long process. So a little bit of I don't think I've ever said this publicly, but like when we took Promise Boys out, me being a filmmaker, I do a lot of different, wear a lot of different hats, but I actually directed a mini audiobook version, very similar to the audiobook version that came out with the whole cast. I did a full production. And so when I took that out, that was I really believe that was one of the things that took Promise to another level and allowed people to really see the vision. And so through the process, they kind of mirrored, what I had done. And we did a whole casting thing, got to listen to a bunch of submissions. It's funny too, because I'm always trying to change things. Like I'm always trying to like change the system. And one of the things that I really wanted was I wanted kids to be able to read for these roles. And I learned that in publishing, they don't allow kids to read, to do audiobooks, right? And I'm like, why? Kids act, there's a way we can figure this out. But that was one thing that I really said, okay, going forward, I need to figure out how I can change that. How can I get kids in these booths reading for these roles and playing these parts, because these are, they're the ones representing these characters. But other than that, it was a great process. That was the one thing I was like, I didn't really understand and wanted to put my foot down. But yeah, so I had a great time and was definitely part of the process.
Sorry, one sec. So you've used so many different mediums in storytelling. What has surprised you the most about writing this book in particular?
Well, one thing I love about published writing books is that it's so real, it's so tangible. In TV and film, I mean, and music, it happens too, but it's a very saturated place. But for a lot of the other things that I do, it's, whether it's TV or film, it's so hard to become real, to become a thing. This process was so straightforward. That really surprised me. I said, hey, we like this, we want this, let's do it. And then we just did it, and then it really came out. And then it was really in stores and really on shelves and people really held it in their hands. That was really surprising to me. Something else was like just the amount of support that I received. I never knew there was such a big team behind books. You think it's the one author's name at the bottom or at the top of the book, and they just kind of sat in the lab and you know what I mean, and put it out. But no, there's a whole team of a lot of people. Over the process of Promise, I want to say, from before taking it out to going through my house at Macmillan, I want to say at least like 4 or 5 editors, and sensitivity readers, and like all of these different people that played really, really major parts to help us come up with the best possible story. So I really appreciated that, and that was surprising, and it was a pleasant surprise.
Question from Kim. Are there ways that you think librarians can help amplify this work that you've begun?
Absolutely. That was something else that was surprising through the process. Librarians are kind of the gatekeepers. They're kind of the big dogs in this arena. So certainly they can help by continuing to make sure that Promise Boys is on shelves in their schools, recommending it to the students. Even if it's on the shelves, saying finding those students. One other thing through this process that I found a lot is that Promise Boys really connects with reluctant readers, right? So librarians being people who are just so astute and usually so caring and understand their students, finding, pulling those kids aside and saying, hey, recommending, hey, I think you might like this book. I think just putting the book in the students' hands and then letting that, do its thing. Or recommending it to other librarians in their district or what have you. But certainly there's, all of those things are things librarians can do to support, and librarians have been supporting, and I'm appreciative of it.
This is a little bit of a callback to the process, but this is from Karen. How did you plan out Promise Boys while writing? With your visual background, are you a storyboard user, note cards and string? Your characters are so developed and their interactions are so complex, it must have been difficult to try to navigate and fit all the pieces together. Could you speak at all to that process?
Absolutely, yeah. I always write from an outline. I definitely need to have an outline to understand exactly what I'm doing. I'll build out my characters. I ask myself a few questions about my characters. What do they want? What do they need? What's their secret? And who do they love? Those are just some of the kind of top questions I ask to really get into the character's mind, and if you look at all of them, they all have answers to those questions, whether it's JB and Kiana, whether it's Ramon and his abuela, or whether it's, when you think about what do they want, Ramon wanting this restaurant, or, of course, Trey really strong that wants to play basketball. And so I always ask those 4 questions, and that helps me really think about my characters. But also, I believe the last author said this as well, but writing what I think really helps, because not just the 3 boys, but all the characters, there's a lot of characters. There's I want to say 36. All the characters in the book, as far as perspective, all the characters in the book, they're all people that I know, that I've met, and Promise was really a process. You talk about therapy again. This is going back to 2020, where I'm like, oh my God, what's happening with the world? And so I'm just kind of pouring out. And all of these characters are people that I know, that I've met. And so that also really helped me, because I was able to pull out certain, whether it was a certain student or a certain interaction, and kind of pour it on the page. So that process for this book, I think that's probably unique. Especially this being my first one, I was able to really release. But so that's unique to this story. But me knowing these characters so well also, was hugely beneficial in developing these characters.
Sorry, I have multiple windows going, so it's hard to find the unmute button. I have a cat in the background, and I don't want her to share her feedback. She did listen to the audiobook, so maybe she does have thoughts. But this is from Alondra. Have your previous students from the charter school reached out to you after reading Promise Boys with their reactions? And if so, what did they think?
That's a great question. They haven't. And again, a lot of the young men I taught, they were when I was working for the organization Concerned Black Men, they were in high school. A lot of them 11th, 12th grade, and so I'm sure they're much older. And then the babies, the 5 and 6-year-olds that I taught which was the really impactful experience for me. I've actually tried to find some of them. I tried to go back and it feels weird because I'm searching these kids' names on the internet, trying to find them, but they haven't reached out. But I definitely would love to connect with my 2 classes of kindergartners that I taught in back-to-back years, and just, if not for Promise, just for the sake of seeing how they're doing, because again, that time in my life was so important to who I am now, that I want to share that with them, so yeah.
From one of our other attendees, since you've worked with elementary kids, do you think you might want to publish more picture books for early readers, or formally share those, or do more of that?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm working on a few different things, actually. I have so what I'm working on now is actually kind of starting my own packaging company, where I'll be working with a lot of different IP that I'm developing, and working with a lot of other young up and coming authors and writers who want to be authors, and figuring out how something that, for example, the story I mentioned earlier, Yanni, something that I'm bringing back for the trade space, and not just for classroom, but it's also something that I feel that there's somebody else that might be better at telling the story about this young Black girl, right? And so even though it's something that I've developed, how can I maybe work with another young talented writer or a young author who wants to break in and empower them, with something I've already kind of gotten a head start on. And so that's something that I'm thinking through. It's like, how do I play in different genres and different age groups, while also it not always having to be the Nick Brooks name at the bottom of the book? How can we empower other writers as well?
So with transitioning from working with youth and teens to then back to kindergartners, and then having works aimed at like different age groups, how is working with each age group different, and like does that affect your approach to storytelling?
It's a great question. It definitely does. I think for the little ones, for me, it was a lot about simplicity, repetition. I approached it from a educator's like background, right? So it's I want to tell a good story, but I also am trying to give them literacy tools. Like I want to teach them rhyming, or I want to teach them pattern recognition, or I want to teach them text to self connections, right? Like I'm approaching it from much more of a teacher perspective, because they're really, really early readers, and I think that's important. And then as I move up, it becomes more about like character and story, and how am I even connecting with the world that we see around us now? Like, how am I including social media, or how am I including, you know what I mean? How am I including these different things that I know? Because now I need to keep your attention. Again, I talked about like reluctant readers, right? And I know just from my own experience, working with some of the kids that I work with, they could be in 11th grade, but maybe not necessarily reading at an 11th grade level, right? And so how do I, for these later readers, how am I developing stories that keep them engaged, that's connecting to the things that they're probably going through in the moment, right? Like, so I think it's kind of like this spectrum, and for me, it goes from how am I giving like strong reading tools and continuing through and then also a good story, and then the further I go along is like, how am I delivering like a really, really good story, and just through allowing just through keeping the reader engaged, I understand that that's strengthening their reading and also like strengthening comprehension. So that's a real like technical answer.
Very interesting though, especially because I feel like especially in a public library, you do end up working with like all different age groups. So I found it very neat. I'm sure hopefully everyone else did too. From Maria, I bet there are a lot of teachers and educators who have stories inside them that they want to tell. What's your advice for getting those stories out in writing, film, music, or other media?
I'm sorry, the first part I didn't hear quite well. If you wouldn't mind
Sure.
repeating for me?
I bet there are a lot of teachers and educators who have stories inside them that they want to tell. What is your advice for getting those stories out in writing, film, music, or other media?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that question even just goes to like basically like, I want to write. Where do I begin, right? And it's like I always say, just start writing. Just again going back to when I was, when I first started with Yanni, I just saw a need in the gap, and I just started. I just said, okay, this is my objective. Another teacher where this is my objective. This is what I'm going to do. And so I think if there's a story you want to tell and you know why you want to tell it, I think just start. Just start putting the words on the page. That's really it sounds kind of like, easy to say, but and so I know it's easier said than done, and it's not like some revolutionary answer, but it really is. You just have to start putting the words on the page, and you got to go from there.
This was a question that Daniel had asked Kelly Yang earlier, but I'm also curious of your perspective. What were you like as a student?
As a student, I was a great student up until probably like high school. In high school, I got bored. Honestly, I got bored, and I was much more interested in. I found a different interest. I found a different passion. It was music. I wanted to write. I wanted to rap, and high school was boring, and I was mischievous because of it, and found myself in a lot of different situations. But there was, I had adults who one was my guidance counselor who really helped me. She just throughout my journey, I had different adult people who saw something in me, right? Who kind of stepped in, and one of those was my guidance counselor, who connected me actually with a college recruiter who also was from DC and had lived in Houston at the time, and he was recruiting for the school called the University of Oklahoma, and which is very random from DC. But he also saw something in me, and he really stepped in and helped me get into school. I wasn't sure, I was like in high school, okay, I got to go to college, do this college thing. And I didn't get into very many schools, and it was kind of like a my only option thing. And he helped me get in through a probationary program, and I did well. I went in and I found that I was able to like become my own self. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm always somebody who's trying to like change the system or challenge the system. And especially if I don't understand why something is the way it is, or I don't understand the rules. If I don't understand the rules, I can't follow the rules because I just don't understand. You kind of got to break it down for me. And so, in my approach to being an educator, I was very much like that. Like, I'll tell a quick story. I know you didn't ask this, but I'll tell a quick story. When I was teaching kindergarten, my very first year, I had a co-teacher, and he was a great guy. He was from Austin, Texas. He was a white guy, and we had a student who would walk around the class all day, and he would constantly get in trouble. He would say, "Brett, sit down, Brett," or I don't want to say his name, but he would say, "Sit down, sit down, sit down." The student was brilliant. At 5, he was reading like at a third grade reading level, and so he was getting him in trouble so much. I had to pull the teacher aside and say, "Hey, when I was a kid, I would get in trouble for walking around the class, and I was told that I had, 88, all these different labels, but it was really just because that's how, he's not bothering anybody. Maybe we should just let him walk around the class." And from that moment on, Brett, like he flourished, you know what I mean? Because he wasn't constantly having to have a conflict with the teachers. And so that's just a small kind of like, I have a bunch of stories like that where it's just like getting into the mind of the student. And basically, to come back to your question, I was one of those type of kids, right? Like where, I didn't always understand why a rule had to be a rule, and maybe it didn't need to be that way, but all the teachers didn't take the time to like work with me there. And sometimes in our culture, it's not, we think we have to tell the student versus like working with the student, right? And so anyway, that's my answer. That's my long answer.
Awesome. Thank you. That was very interesting. And thank you so much for all your time and answering all of our questions and sharing more about your background.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Eli. Nick, you remind me exactly of my brother, everything you said. So I'm probably going to slide your book into his hands from the music on.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I appreciate it. Let me know, and I would love to stay in touch.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Both of your books are also already checked out, discussion set. So they're in the hands of students as we speak. So thank you so much. I really think this book is going to hit hard and do a lot of good with the readers of Connecticut. So thank you so much. And thank you, Eli, for your time here.